To your point, Wes, welcome everybody, and thanks for joining us. Wes, a little bit about, this CMMC isn't something new if you are in the defense industrial base, your clients are, but what is new is the vastly changing landscape by the day. And I couldn't think of a better idea at this point as we go into really the last part of the year than to get you, David, Ken, and especially Ryan Bonner on a call and update everybody on what the heck is going on, because it is a fast moving target. And we want to make sure that you guys are up to speed. So with that, let me start off welcoming the CISO of Perch. Wes, welcome. How are you?
Hey, Andrew, thanks for having me. I'm doing great. Better now that we got this guy kicked off and ready to go.
Excellent. I'm going to move over to, I am sorry, darn it.
You're a popular guy, Andrew.
Fun with an apple. Ken Tripp of Netwrix, you guys have been doing a ton on the product with Ryan Bonner for CUI Discovery. So I thought it was really applicable to bring you guys on. Welcome, Ken.
Absolutely. Thanks, Andrew. Thanks for having us. And yeah, Ryan's been a great help to us here at Netwrix. So excited to hear what he has to say today as well.
Excellent. And the perennial, what I would call Roll Tide man and MSP legend, David Powell. David, how are you?
I'm doing good. Glad to be here. And yeah, this topic kind of for the MSPs, at least I used to be at an MSP before I came over here, kind of came out of nowhere. It's like CMMC was this like thing that was supposed to be out there somewhere. And then, as we know, the government tends to take their time on stuff. And then all of a sudden, like, no, we're going to do it. And holy crap, everybody had to run and scramble. So I can identify with everyone on here from sitting in your seats around CMMC not being a thing to suddenly being a thing in a hurry.
Yeah, and you guys were big, David, and you guys were in a lot of the areas where your clients were in the defense industry.
Yeah, and Ryan will probably talk about this, but the DoD industry had a supplier diversity initiative over the past 10 years, which was great. So they got all these mom and pops suddenly in the supply chain instead of just the Raytheons and the Northrop Grummans. But then all of a sudden CMMC comes out and all these mom and pops suddenly have to adhere to this standard, and they've got an MSP as their IT shop. So, the victim a little bit of their own success on supplier diversity now creates complexity for guys that really don't have that kind of level of security maturity that you would possibly want them to have.
Yeah, and of course, there's no cost to get ready for this at all either. David.
No, yeah, it's free.
So speaking of that, let's talk about our expert, Ryan Bonner. Ryan, can you tell the folks that may not know you out there a little bit about yourself? And then before I hand the reins over to Wes, I want to tell everybody what they should be paying attention to, because I'm going to be paying attention to chat because you're going to have an opportunity to win something really cool. Ryan, tell us a little about yourself.
Sure. So again, my name is Ryan Bonner. I'm a compliance consultant focusing almost exclusively on the topics of DFARS, compliance for cybersecurity, implementations of things like NIST 800-171 for defense contractors, and how all of that is really culminating in the industry through CMMC, the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification. So tracking all of those topics, tracking what's happening in the enforcement space, and then trying to find ways to achieve, I guess you could say, cost efficiencies and scalability in the industry for really, small businesses who, for a lot of them, this is their first time having to face down a lot of enterprise cybersecurity requirements.
Yeah, Ryan, and one of the things, again, that the partners out here may not know is that a lot of your work is with MSPs and MSSPs. Is that fair to say?
Increasingly so. Yeah. So when we first got into this space, that people who were paying attention to this were NIST manufacturing extension programs and DoD Office of Economic Adjustment funded opportunities, state-based development groups. So sort of like public-private. And then as this has become a reality for the individual small businesses, you start to realize that MSPs are being described as the force multiplier in all of this. So they're the ones that are going to be able to make the biggest difference for the defense industrial base.
Ryan, one thing we're hearing in the chat is, are we going to see your lovely in-person face, or are we just going to see the Ryan Bonner mugshot? But just want you to know the fan base out there is wondering.
This is a curated face here that we're looking at. No. I was telling Wes, I just had to set up some new equipment last night, and I haven't gotten my my fancy SLR camera back online yet.
The reality actually is that we couldn't afford the real Ryan Bonner, so we licensed the AI Ryan Bonner. So what you hear is just right out of his brain, hooked up, and just an audio feed.
That's awesome, Wes.
It's in my rider.
Yeah.
Okay. So what I'm going to do is give you guys just a thought as we go through this today. Ken Tripp and Netwrix put up some money to get Ryan to do a 1-hour consulting gig to a lucky winner out there. That lucky winner is going to be chosen as I look through here and we get some good questions. I'm going to note those questions and we will pick somebody in that manner. So again, Ken, thank you for doing that. Ryan, thank you for doing that. Perch, thank you for being here as well. And with that, Wes, I'm going to mute myself. I'll come back on and, camera wise, if I see questions that we need to interject, but the show
Great.
is yours, my friend.
All right, Andrew, thank you. And Andrew, you did not introduce yourself, so I'm going to introduce you. I think most of you on the call do know Andrew Morgan. He is the host and founder of the Cyber Call. Definitely check that out. Andrew, if you don't mind to pop into chat a link to the Cyber Call for those that may want to join. We do free thought leadership, 0 sales pitches, all fun security discussions, and also is the founder of the Cyber Nation. So if you would like to carry on the CMMC conversation, I think all of us here in the Cyber Nation, great private place for us all to put our guard down and discuss what's going on around us. So without further ado, we're going to go ahead and get kicked off and get started. So thank you guys for joining. We are at over 100 people have joined, so that is really good, and we're going to see more. So one thing you can do is just pop into LinkedIn and be like, hey, we've started this whole thing. Pop a link out if you can. I'd love to see you guys share this out and get other people to join in. So let's start with this. Ryan, I want to kick it off to you because you spend a lot of time in the world of CMMC, more than any of us, probably all of us combined. So, just talk to us. Let's start high level, right? I want to start real high and then we'll zoom in as we start to dive into all of this. So high level, talk to us about some of the recent updates, the recent happenings around CMMC and where you think clients are right now in their preparation with CMMC.
Sure. So just, I'm sure that if you're here on this discussion today, you've heard about CMMC in some way, shape, or form. So you've had a chance to download all the publicly available tools, the model documents themselves. So we're not going to spend too much time there. Really, what people need to understand is that the model itself that organizations were going to have to put into place has been known for a while. What we didn't know is the way that enforcement was going to be structured around that. So what we're seeing now in the industry is a staged implementation of overall enforcement of the compliance regulations. So we started way back in 2016 with a self-attestation model where you get contracts as a defense contractor and you promise that at some point, pinky swear, I'm going to start doing something about security. So here's a set of technical guidance documents, primarily NIST 800-171, and wink, wink, nudge, nudge, you'll be working on that. Strangely though, nobody's cost on bids went up at all. So, I swear I'm doing all of these security things that cost money, but my pricing is staying the same. So obviously that doesn't pass the smell test, and the same amount of data is still being exfiltrated to other nation states. So we're going to have to do something about this. So that was really the genesis of CMMC. What we've seen now is a series of new contract clauses that have come out that sort of like dip your toes into the water of more and more stringent enforcement and a higher level of situational awareness for the DoD. So the first step in that phase is to go beyond self-attestation and to ask defense contractors to give themselves a points-based score on where they're at with a lot of these core topics. So Just for those of you who don't have these dots connected, NIST 800-171 under the self-attestation model is fully represented in CMMC. So sometimes those are really talked about interchangeably. So the latest DFARS contract clauses that are going to start to be baked into contracts, they require you to go back to 800-171, give yourself a points-based score on progress, and upload that to a DoD site. And so what that does is it creates a situation where the DoD now has some basic information about you. But again, you came up with that score. So what is the confidence level that that score is accurate? Well, it's low. So what we're going to see beyond that is then another contract clause that'll be rolled out in a more limited fashion that compels you to schedule an on-site high confidence assessment from the Defense Contract Management Agency. So they'll come in and they'll assign you a point score rather than you self-reporting one. And that's all good, well and good, but you got to remember that there's only so many of those people working for DCMA. So where this really scales and reaches the rest of the industry is through CMMC. So the third and final DFARS clause that was rolled out, if you're scribbling notes, it's DFARS clause 252.204-7021. So, real actionable information there. That contract clause, if that's in a bid or an opportunity that comes out, then whatever the level of data is that you're going to receive under that contract, you have to have a CMMC certification on file that matches that required level. So what that does is it creates a scenario where you can start to see new opportunities coming out, and you're going to know whether or not you have a CMMC certification, whether you can even participate or whether you should even bother sending back a bid response. So I think it's important to note that a lot of organizations now are reading these new contract clauses, and it's starting to become real. There's now a series of mechanisms in place that actually bring this to your front door.
Got it. Okay, so there's a lot of things we're going to unpack in today's session with all of that. So Ryan, that is really good to know, and that history of where it's coming from. And I was even on I was speaking at a maritime virtual conference yesterday, and had one of the admirals of the Coast Guard talking, and I would say 30% of his talk was about CMMC. And it was about what's going on with them. And everywhere I look, everywhere I talk, we see discussion around this. So we're going to be covering all these things and more. And a couple of housekeeping notes that I missed that I want to go back to first. If you guys have a question, would you put that into the Q&A? And the reason for that is that will make sure that we go back and answer, because we're going to end up having a lot of chat through all this, and I don't want to scroll and miss one. So for example, I think I saw a couple really good ones from Alan. Yeah, so Alan, if you'll make sure to pop both of those questions in the Q&A, we'll get to those. Chris, same for you. And then my second ask for everybody was, will you turn your chat from just panelists only to panelists and attendees? And the reason that will be helpful is as you're chatting, we can actually chat back to you. And that way people will see who we're replying back to, and it won't seem like this weird, strange answer that comes out of the blue. They'll actually see the question too. So that would be really helpful if you would do both of those things for us. So let's do this. As we kind of jump in, Ryan, another kind of follow-up question for you is, I think it's good for us to sort of do a litmus test, if you will, just a way to kind of see where we're all at. Like, there's probably a lot of people on this call that are like, look, CMMC, I know it's important. I've got some clients that we're going to have to go down this road. And I think we're at different varying journeys, one to another, and different levels of maturity that are on this call. And that's okay, right? That's why we're on the call. So let's talk about some litmus test things that a client and an MSP could start to think about to know their level of preparedness. So let's go ahead and do that now. Can you give us a litmus test of maybe some questions that the client should be answering, that the MSP should be answering and thinking about, and both the MSP and the client? Can you kind of walk through some of those things?
Absolutely. So let's start with the actual client themselves, the defense contractor. One of the easiest questions that you can ask them now is, do you have a working definition of what CUI is? So for the uninitiated, CUI is controlled unclassified information. And you could spend hours, days, weeks digging into that as a topic. But the simple fact is that if a defense contractor doesn't know what types of CUI they traditionally receive from customers or from agencies, or that they produce in contracts as deliverables, this is all for naught, because they don't know what data is being handled by who and on what IT systems. It's a very data-driven discussion. They don't know if they're meeting their requirements for subcontractor flow down and all these other things, if they don't know what data is earmarked for better safeguarding and protection in the first place. So that obviously drives some questions to the individual contractors, but the easiest way to get a working definition of whether or not someone has CUI is just, do you handle export controlled information? If you do, then that marked information with ITAR, EAR, it's going to be CUI. And ask them if they get things with distribution statements on them, B through F. If they do, it's going to be CUI. So you can at least start with those rudimentary definitions and then build out from there. You need something to reference against.
And Ryan, Corey is asking, has the government actually identified what CUI, or as Tim is calling it, CUI, actually is? Is that like a tightly defined definition, or is that still being worked through?
Yeah, there's plenty of legally driven definitions. The federal law 32 CFR 2002 is where that's initially defined. But then we have these other tools, like the National Archives and Records Administration operates what's called the CUI repository. And that's going to be a list of all of the different categories and subcategories of CUI. So that can help you out as well. DoD has their own CUI registry that's going to have all of those same definitions, plus in the future a few others that DoD is hoping to develop. But there are definitions that are out there. The trick is not getting too lost on developing the most perfect definition possible that covers every possible type, but to start now with the ones that are most easily identified, while the individual agencies are still sorting out how they're going to communicate that to you.
And Ryan, one more follow-up question on that litmus test to the client. If you were to walk into just the average DoD manufacturer that's under 800-171, et cetera, and you ask that question of, do you know what your CUI is or CUI is? What percentage would give you like a blank stare versus they're starting to be educated around it versus what do you think the answers would be across the board?
I think more than 70% of the time you're getting blank stares. And that's because the agencies themselves haven't started very clearly marking and sort of bird dogging these pieces of data and saying, hey, what I'm about to send you is CUI. You're never going to get that level of care and diligence from large monolithic agencies. And so you really have to command your own destiny on this. You have to have your own working definition and apply it against data when you get it.
Got it. Okay. So then let's talk about the MSP then, because ultimately that's who is the audience on this call today, mostly. So what are some litmus tests that you would ask to an MSP?
So the biggest question I think that you can ask an MSP as it pertains to their end client and their environments is, do you have a highly accurate, up-to-date system inventory? And by that, I don't mean just the systems that you're paid to manage, that you have an RMM client on. I'm talking about every IP addressable anything that is on that network. And the reason for that is because when you go to initiate a CMMC assessment to become certified, you need to scope that assessment with the assessor. And part of scoping that is developing what we would call your boundary, your system boundary. If I can't clearly identify which system components and IT assets are in the scope and out of the scope, I don't have a scope. And so I literally can't agree on what's going to be assessed and certified.
And that makes a lot of sense, right? Like this is not new to regulatory concepts of what's in scope and out of scope. For example, I remember dealing with, and Ken, I'm sure you can speak to this as well, but I remember dealing a few months ago with a partner of ours at Perch that's like, hey, look, I've got to retain everything for 7 years because I've got some legal documentation for some law firms that's covered under their regulatory guidance. And I said, well, can we look into that? And come to find out, it's only for systems that contain and manage legal information that's protected information under police and legal jurisdiction. And all of a sudden the game changer for him. He's like, oh, so I just need to define what those systems are, and it doesn't have to be every system under God's green earth. I'm like, no. So that's kind of a normal working definition of a lot of regulatory frameworks, right? I'm going to go off script and ask Ken, because I see you nodding your head. That's very common in regulatory frameworks, right?
Absolutely, right. And then when you're looking at these systems, and Ryan was speaking of the CUI, et cetera, it's prioritizing, that data and what actually is sensitive. And you start getting into rot removal, and some of it you do have to keep for 7 years, is some of it's stale. And it's really about reducing, we always talk about reducing the attack surface, right? Well, now we're really concentrating on reducing that data footprint that puts your company or the client that you're servicing in incredible trouble, right? So completely agree with that. And then it comes back to systems and the regular auditing and how you measure that. But that little rub for CMMC is definitely the CUI, but still those basic hygiene principles of security always will apply.
Got it. Okay, so I want to get to some of the questions that are coming in. We're going to answer those in here in just a second, but I want to follow up just on that last piece. So we did the litmus test question that you might ask to a client, what's CUI, all that kind of stuff. To the MSP, have you defined your scope, your inventories, what's in scope, what's out of scope, those sorts of things. Thirdly, Ryan, what would you ask as the litmus test to kind of gauge where you're at to both the MSP and the clients?
Yeah, and that's really important, because the way that both parties interface with each other and add up to something that's greater than the sum of their parts is really, what do they perform against? And so, MSPs have service agreements, but what I don't see a lot of is really answering the question to both the MSP and to the client, like, do you perform against metrics? How do you measure the actions that you're taking, and how do you know that they're effective in their application? So that's a really big part of this discussion, because we have requirements in CMMC that we monitor all of our controls for their continued effectiveness. And we also have a lot of requirements that have to do with reviews and updates. And so if we don't have metrics to judge ourselves against under security assessments, risk assessments, continuous monitoring exercises, things like that, we won't know what a successful outcome looks like. And it becomes harder and harder to show an assessor that you actually manage your entire organization at a mature level.
Okay, got it. Thank you. So let's turn to some of the questions that we have coming in. We'll start with Chris's question, just a point of clarification. Ryan, did you say DFARS 252.204-7021 or not or the ending of 7012? Which was the one you were referring to?
Yeah, it's 7021. So DoD doesn't do us any favors. They flip-flop numbers. So the original self-attestation clause is 7012. And then the new 3 clauses are 7019, which is for a self-assessment score, 7020, which is your DCMA assessment on site, and then 7021, which is CMMC. Okay,
got it. Next question from Alan, and I think you can probably see that one, but he says at his company, they're taking the responsibility to provide options as a complete cybersecurity suite to answer each CMMC level, and then also PCI and HIPAA. But this is a good question. What liability do we have if our customers decline protection?
Yeah, so I mean, liability is a somewhat ephemeral term, right? Like, what do we mean by that? Really, the liability is that if you offered something and, explained why it matters and what CMMC requirements it's designed to contribute towards or directly satisfy or be inheritable from the MSP, and they say no, I would say that most of the liability is going to lie with the customer. Because now if they are making claims that they're working really hard on cybersecurity, yet constantly shooting down all of your proposed capabilities, then it's going to be harder for them to make that statement. I don't know that there's any prevailing precedent that the MSP would somehow be in hot water over that.
Okay, got it. And then just that follow-up question, what liability do they have if the suggested solutions fail to address the protection levels by design or implementation?
So there's no such thing as a completely secure system, right? So I'm just going to build this answer on the assumption that everything that was proposed and put in place was done to industry best practices. You had good actionable data, and that for some reason it just wasn't as effective as we thought. There's actually mechanisms built into CMMC just for that. So if you do find a deficiency in the way you were doing something, as long as you're incorporating that into a plan of action to remediate that problem, then you're doing everything you're supposed to be doing in an iterative, cyclical, life cycle managed cybersecurity program.
Okay, got it. Brian, good question. He says, a longtime listener, first time caller. Is it safe to assume that other departments within the federal government, aside from the DoD, will be adopting and requiring CMMC compliance with their agencies? And if so, can you please elaborate on what you know today?
Sure. So we have gotten some public statements from the Department of Homeland Security that they're very interested in the application of CMMC in domestic contracting. We've also just tangentially heard some things that the Department of Energy is taking a look at it and things like that. Here's the thing to keep in mind. All federal agencies have until the end of next year to implement their CUI programs. And there's only one certifiable model that's written specifically around the topics of safeguarding CUI. So I'll let you connect the dots on whether or not that's going to be applicable at a federal level across the board.
Okay, got it. It's good. Okay, so I'm going to combine two questions together. You didn't think I had that in me. So Jim and Mark are both asking similar questions. So I'm going to not only combine the questions, I'm going to combine your names. So you guys are now JARC. We do this at Perch a lot. We combine names. So JARC is asking together, who completes the audit and when will those auditors be sent out to perform the assessments?
You know, JARC, that's a great question. And I think one of the things that we need to understand is the segmented relationship that exists between the organization that you book your assessment with and then the assessors who come out. So the C3PAO, the third party assessing organization, is who you're going to reach out to and say, hey, we need to schedule an assessment, whether that's your customer or you, the MSP. And then they are going to send out assessors after they fully scope and agree on how this assessment is going to function. So the assessors come out on site, potentially virtually, we'll see what the future brings. And then they're going to take all of their findings and bring them back to home base for the C3PAO to provide their own oversight and review of. And then they're going to kick their recommendation for a pass or fail result up to the CMMC accreditation body itself. That goes through a QA process and then a decision is rendered. So the C3PAO is not necessarily performing the audits. It's their assessors that are doing it. The assessors who come on site, their job is to validate what they can and to produce, good data to basically drive the pass fail recommendation. So they're there in a data capture mode, if that makes sense. So the more data you feed them, the more quickly they can validate what they're able to find. And I would just say that the focus for the assessor, the reason they're not being called auditors is because they're there to validate and confirm, not to audit and throw red flags, if that makes sense. That's the only way that this whole model moves quickly through the entire defense industrial base.
Got it. Okay, really good. And so in case you don't know, C3PAO is C3PO's older brother, little lesser known. He's a little bitter. He's not been in any of the movies, but just so now that you know. Okay, so Ed is also asking, and this is a good question right here, and part of a big piece of what we're talking about today. So Ed says, as MSPs, some of our clients are just contractors for the DoD. Does that mean that we, the MSPs, have to be certified? Ryan.
That is probably the billion-dollar question as to whether or not MSPs themselves need to be certified. So what I'm about to say is just my synthesis of everything that I'm seeing publicly stated. We've received statements in the past that MSPs will need to be CMMC certified in order to provide services. That's come directly from the mouths of the primary spokespeople within DoD who manage the CMMC model. What we don't have is any formal or official DoD policy that makes that true. So here's a big thing that we need to be aware of. The contract clauses under DFARS that define something as a covered system only apply to systems that store and process and transmit the data. It doesn't apply to systems that merely access the data. So if I'm an MSP, accessing a client environment does not automatically mean I have covered contractor systems. So that's an important side note to just track, because those are the current legal guardrails that we have. So I could see there being scenarios where MSPs do not themselves need to be certified, let's say beyond level 1, even if they are servicing a level 3 client, for example, which is the bulk of the industry that I've worked with in the last several years.
Hey, Ron, I do think there's a little bit of precedent though for this. Like when HIPAA came out, if you recall, the covered entity had all the legal, if you will, compliance requirements. And if you're the business associate, the MSP, it didn't apply to you. And then high tech came out because they realized that basically the MSPs kind of had this get out of jail free card, and the covered entity was absorbing all the liability while they were utilizing, the MSP as their IT outsourced shop. So then, when high tech came out, the same responsibilities that apply to the covered entity, which is a healthcare provider, became applicable to the business associates. So, even if it doesn't come out immediately, I think there is precedent around, hey, we're going to put these requirements on the company, and then oops, they realize how intertwined, the service provider and the company are, and realize that they can't really stop that compliance requirements there, and they do have to extend them on. So it
100%,
wouldn't surprise me if it ends up there based on kind of historical precedent around that.
So essentially what we're learning here is that the DoD is playing catch up on situational awareness. They tend to look at small business as functioning just like an agency. Everything's internally staffed. You have this big team.
Yeah.
There's reports and reports of reports, and all these other functions that simply don't exist in small business. So DoD is effectively less aware than they could be about the role that MSPs play.
Yep.
So if the maybe not answer for certification of MSPs is based on the definition of a covered system, the maybe so definition from the same contractual obligations is how subcontractor flow downs work. So there's a requirement that the DoD contractor needs to flow down the exact same requirements to their subcontractors, aka an MSP, if that MSP provides operationally critical support on the performance of a contract. IT systems and uptime and things like that could probably fall into that category once precedent is set. So if we've got guardrails for maybe not and maybe so, that's what we're bouncing back and forth between. But I think there's a middle ground that is more strategically important. And that's the fact that when a CMMC assessor sits down to assess an MSP's end client, and they say, hey, I have to talk to and interview the person who's responsible for technical topic X. There's nothing in this world precluding the DoD contractor from saying, that's my MSP, and the MSP having a seat at that table and being as important in the pass-fail result as the end client themselves.
Yep.
So if I'm an MSP and I've gone and gotten a CMMC certification myself, then I can say, we're doing this for this end client the same way we did it over here, and we've already been certified. Here's structured documentation that shows that. And I think that really simplifies and streamlines the assessment process. So I could really see MSPs building a best practice internally, being certified against it, and then doing likewise for their clients for rapid turnaround on certifications.
And David, that was your tact where you came from at the MSP that you came from, correct?
Yeah, I think there's this Mark has a question up here, and just to briefly address it and allow it that answer is, there is this sense that the client wants to subscribe to CMMC compliance, right? And like Ryan mentioned out of the gate, this is very different than a lot of the other stuff around proving metrics and stuff like that, is that there's been a lot of certifications that MSPs have gone through over the years, whether it's SOC 2 Type 2 or whether it's ISO. And some of those are just barely compliance oriented, where you just have to show proof that you do the thing. So hey, do you have a policy? Well, yeah, here's my policy. And they're like, okay, they have the policy, check. And you don't have to prove any performance against it, right? And so that's that metric thing that Ryan was talking about earlier, is that you have to prove, are we continually measuring this and adapting to it and all that kind of stuff. And so there's a lot of work that the MSP has to do themselves to kind of prepare for this, which a lot of those questions are related to. And then you have this sense on the client side where they're like, can't I just write you a big check and you just make all this stuff magically happen? And as is talked about in the chats here, is where it's not just a technical thing. It's technical, it's policy, it's adherence, it's measurements, it's continual education, and all this kind of stuff gets wrapped in. And, where we were before, we really wanted to start out with the client and help them understand, here's the scope, here's what all this is. It was very education oriented. And we had a client that looked at that and it's like, holy crap, this only represents like 10% of our revenue is this DoD work. And instead of spending all this money, they elected to sell the blueprints and the intellectual property that they had around this thing to a upstream provider instead of, I think somebody mentioned one time that none of these companies have on their P&L cybersecurity compliance, with this massive number amount out to the side. So there does become this kind of, calculus they have to look at. It's like, okay, this is what it's going to cost to be CMMC level 3. This is how much revenue we're getting from our DoD work, because we make widgets for the DoD, but we also make widgets for a whole bunch of non-DoD stuff. And then that helps them really understand their risk and then go forward. So we always started around with first like assessment, loose assessment, right? Not detail, but loose assessment, education, explain to them as like, okay, here's what all you would have to do. And lots of times they're like, we don't make enough money from our DoD work to do that. We're not Northrop Grumman or Raytheon. And then it would be like a path of, okay, here's the stuff you can do. Here's the stuff we can do. And, it has to be very collaborative. It's not something they can just kind of dump off to the MSP and expect them to check all those boxes on their behalf.
Yeah, David, that's a phenomenal point. And Ken, you and I had talked about this before. Wes, you were part of that conversation as well. These requirements put the defense contractors into a very leveraged position where they have to decide whether this is part of their future. And Wes, I think you had brought up one of the analogies that's out there, that this really starts to feel a lot like the HIPAA, high-tech, and EMR transitions in healthcare from 10 years ago, which is, I'm a small business, in that case, it was small doctor's office, contractors. If I'm at a certain career stage, or if the business is at a certain point, I may just choose to either close my doors or sell the book of business or allow my whole company to be bought. And it's mass consolidation. So that's a definite outcome I think we're staring down the barrel of.
Yeah, I think that's the outcome of regulations often, is that when a particular industry does not do the right things for many different reasons, sometimes the government has to move that needle. And that's a political discussion we don't need to get into, of whether that's right or wrong or best or worst or whatever. But you're exactly right. If you look at what HIPAA did, I remember having some conversations with my dad about this. He worked at University of Florida. And I was talking to a few of his friends there at UF's research hospital, Shands. And I remember when EMR was first being forced, he's like, I'm so glad this has happened, because he's like, how do I tell a leading heart surgeon that he's got to change some of the things that he's doing and the processes he has in place? And I'm just a lowly IT guy. And yet it needs to happen from a security perspective. Finally, it took regulation to force it, and he didn't have a choice. It's either stay in business and do these things, or you're gone and you're out. Ken, I mean, this is what we see with regulation often, right?
Absolutely. And I used to be with an EMR, and we thought we could provide managed services behind our technology, and boy, were we wrong, right? So yeah, but you're seeing a lot of those same regulations kind of speak to each other, right? They're all ice cream. They're just kind of different flavors, and that concentration on the little niches that create some differences between them is where you become that expert, right? So, and we've talked about measurement, and I think the big thing is it's not as hard as it seems, right? A lot of new terms when you're looking at controlled unclassified information and being able to measure that. And really it starts with accuracy, right? Being able to, like Ryan was talking about, a points-based score and a confidence level, and being able to say, okay, I've identified that CUI for you, and I'm giving you a score, and we can boost, because not all of the markings might not be completely accurate, but for the most part, they're standardized, right? And once you kind of can control that data set, now all of a sudden, just like you do with your other regulations, you start auditing that data, right? From unauthorized changes to permissions, access control, then user behavior, right? Overexposed, excessive permissions. And what you're doing is you're applying that least privilege model, like you do in all these different other regulations, to CMMC. That fact is just making sure you understand where that data is, where it is, who's got access to it, and then combining that with different technologies. And that's where Perch comes in, right? That's where even maybe a DLP comes in, and different types of technologies to build that layer. So it's not as frightening as it sounds. It's just a little bit different, but it's things that our MSP partners have adapted to over the years for different regs.
And it's, you know, as Felicia said here in the chat, I thought it was really, she had a great statement, is that, you know, this is not a project. A project is something that begins and ends and has a completion date. This is a process that goes in place. And David, maybe a question for you as a pivot or a follow-up from that is, you know, I'm not sure how many MSPs, especially in your experience, are prepared for this, right? Are they still thinking that this is a project that they just have to get done and get complete and I'm done with this? And I think maybe even another question for you, David, kind of combined into two, is there's sales opportunities having this as a process that never ends as well, right?
Right. And the phrase I always use around that is commitment versus compliance, right? And I often talk about recycling here at my house is on Tuesdays, right? And I want my kids to take the recycling down on Tuesdays. They will do it if I tell them, hey, take the recycling down on Tuesdays. That's compliance. What I want is their commitment, right? Where they know to take this down on Tuesdays. And that's that whole kind of shift I think Felicia was talking about to some degree, where this is not where you go tell people, I need you to do this thing because auditors are coming in next week. And so everybody kind of scurries around and gets stuff ready and the auditors come in and then they, you know, produce it. It's this persistent commitment to this, you know, this standard and continually measuring, and you want everybody aligned that way. And it's this culture of compliance, this culture of security. And it is not just a one and done kind of thing, because a lot of these environments, you know, are far from static. So they're constantly moving, they're constantly evolving. And so as an MSP, you know, we run into that, like when Ron was talking earlier about like inventory. Man, most MSPs on this call, I would suggest probably have a closet in the back with all this gear stacked up on it. And when a client, something dies, they send a tech out and he installs a new thing. Did they ever update the document management about that? Or was it just in such a hurried fashion that they went and deployed the new thing? And look, I get it. It just happens all the time, you know, that way. Or do they have a lot of automation built in where they've got, you know, shared credentials? And when Wes left, well, we didn't really want to go through and have to update 60 different admin creds. So we just hope that Wes is a good guy and that kind of stuff. Well, none of that gets to be in play. So we always have that security convenience exchange rate. To adhere to this stuff, convenience has to come way down in exchange for all this, you know, security. And most MSPs are wired to be quick, wired to serve a lot of customers, wired to have convenient access to client systems. And the more you have to meet all these compliance with regulatory standards, the more complexity that introduces, which is really, you know, not the nature of an MSP that's really trying to move quick and move fluidly and remove obstacles instead of putting obstacles in the way because their compliance standard requires it.
Yeah. And real quick on that too, David, just like you said, it's, you know, environments aren't static and neither is the data. It's constantly changed, modified, created, and it's got to be a continuous thing. I couldn't agree more with that. And then also with that continuation model and commitment, like you said, I think that's what brings the value to the end client as an MSP, right? So when we always hear, oh, they don't want to spend the money, if you go out with that plan, show your level of commitment, how you're going to take care of them and walk them through this journey on a continuous basis, it really will be good for business. So
yeah.
Okay, so we have a laundry list of questions, and as I see it, we have 15 minutes left. We are not going to get all these questions answered. I wish we could, and we actually have a ton of other content that we were going to share, like the CMMC kill chain. Anyone here in chat seen the CMMC kill chain? I hope you have. If you haven't, go Google it. You can see more about it. Ryan, here's my thoughts. Why don't we abandon our content and just focus on answering questions for the rest of the 15 minutes? What do you think?
Oh, I'm your Huckleberry.
Okay, so Here we go. Speed round has begun. I need some like sound effects for this. We're just going to start firing through these questions. We'll see where we get, and if we don't get them all done, we'll see what happens. Okay, so Jack is asking, what's your perspective on CMMC, and will impact the AS 9100 compliance standards in the future?
So AS 9100 quality management system, similar to ISO 9001, both of them in their most recent update started to add risk management as a concept at a high level, which is awesome. There's still not a ton of overlap between those right now. I'd love to see cyber risk fully integrated into the high level management of an organization. I don't have any crystal ball that's going to tell me that something is going to be a certain way in regards to that. On the ISO side, you've already got ISO 27001 and 27002 that are designed to interact and interlock with ISO 9001. So it's possible that we might see some more cyber topics introduced into 9100, but I think the biggest takeaway is that if you can get the same kinds of people at your end client who do quality management to start doing cybersecurity, that is a way better starting point than a lot of other skill sets. Those people know how to identify defects. They know how to manage against metrics. They know how to raise red flags. They know how to do a lot of things that will really help you in that process.
Hey,
Okay.
Wes, some quick questions I see over there on Office 365. That is not CMMC compliant now. So with that, Ron, what's the thought on Office 365 in these environments?
So the whole cloud topic is way more of a DFARS consideration than anything that you find in the CMMC model itself. The simple fact is that under the DFARS 7012 clause that we talked about, cloud providers have to do a couple of things. They have to provide adequate security under what's called a shared responsibility model called FedRAMP Moderate. That's 325 controls, I believe. So the cloud provider can do some of that for you. Just depends on the nature of the control. The other thing that the cloud provider has to do is they have to be able to adhere to all of the rapid reporting and incident response and support paragraphs that are in that same clause. That's where a lot of cloud providers get off the train, because one of the things you have to provide is access to the original equipment involved in the incident. And I don't know of a lot of cloud providers that are going to let DoD into their data center and take a SAN home with them for forensics. So
You don't think Microsoft will meet them at the door with it packaged up all nicely?
here's the thing: Microsoft will in like 3 of their data centers. So they have an offering called GCC High, Government Community Cloud High, where they actually will agree to those requirements. But
Okay.
you wouldn't expect to get that out of the commercial offering.
Okay, great. So let's pick another one here, and I'm probably just going to go top down for now, but feel free to, Ryan, if you want to skip around to some of these. But so Matt, I think this is a good one. I think we can agree that the rollout of CMMC hasn't been great. The appearance of pay-to-play, AB members being ousted, conflicting information. Does this affect the rollout? Also, my org paid thousands of dollars to go down the cert route, but we haven't heard anything back regarding training. How can CMMC be enforced when there are hardly any C3PAOs?
Yeah, so the way that DoD is trying to like roll into this implementation is in the new DFARS clauses that came out and all of the guidance around it. The DoD Acquisition and Sustainment Office has to green light the inclusion of CMMC in contracts so that you don't have this runaway train of contracting officers who are specifying it when there aren't enough certified companies out there to conceivably do the work. So that's one aspect of that. In regards to the overall CMMC rollout itself, in the absence of formal policy and guidance from the DoD, all sorts of people are going to come out of the woodwork, right? Looking to capitalize on opportunities or fear, uncertainty, and doubt. There's definitely been that in any industry that's about to become regulated. And I think that's one of those things where on a long enough timeline, the hucksters are going to be found out as not really being able to get you through an assessment. The assessors who don't do a good job are not going to be assessors for very long. Whether or not being like a registered professional or practice a provider organization under the AB's model, you'll have to talk to the folks in marketing to see if that's paying dividends. But yeah, I would say that the actions that acquisition and sustainment over on the DoD side is done to limit the rollout of CMMC to a survivable level is a really important mechanism we should be paying attention to.
Got it. Okay. This is a good one sort of on the sales angle and messaging angle from Mark. We have a client that's been dragging their feet until they decide they want it done, and they want it done now right away, has to have it done. And so, it says once they realize this is going to be a long process that costs money, where do we start as the MSP partners? Is there a good system or guide to follow?
Well, we mentioned some good resources on how to order out which CMMC practices you might tackle first, the CMMC kill chain being that. Many thanks to Tom Cornelius over at Compliance Forge for just putting that out in the open for anyone to pick up and run with. The simple fact is that you're always going to have organizations who wait until the last possible minute. So I think as an MSP, you have to have sort of here's how we would do it if you give us the time in a healthy relationship. And then here's the just-in-time blank check. Oh my God, we need this or we're going to lose X millions in contracts option, the nuclear option, if you will. So MSPs need to find the customers who are forward-thinking enough to start making progress now, because you've got to cut your teeth on these topics. You've got to build your internal documentation. You've got to understand your reference architectures that you're going to put in, your vendor stack, all of those things now, because when the, oh my gosh, I need it yesterday, people start showing up, you don't have time for system design and vendor selection and any of that stuff. You've just got to start taking action. So you got to solve for both sides of the coin.
Got it. Right.
I think
right
one
on.
of the eases on the peace of mind too is it's good to get that stack in place because it's coming, right? This isn't a guess. So like Ryan said, that coming up with the stack, being ready when they knock on your door, it's something that we can prepare for and know is coming.
Yeah, we talked about some of the DFARS difficulties that come with using certain tools and things like that. So we also know that there's going to be organizations who don't have a choice but to lift and shift a particular tool or capability or whatever it may be. So let's just do some rough math here. There's an estimated 300 to 350,000 defense contractors. I'm going to go with the low number. That doesn't really take into account a lot of the subcontractors. So I'm actually putting that number at over 1 million. The average defense contractor has 75 employees. These aren't huge companies. So that means that using all the lowest estimates, to 22.5 million seats of DFARS compliance licensing are going to need to be implemented in the next 5 years.
Okay, so we have 7 minutes left. We need to reserve probably 2 for us to close shop and announce a winner. So what that means is, Ryan, you get to choose the next question to answer. I'm going to let you kind of scroll through and pick that question that you would like to answer. We will not get to all of these, unfortunately, today, as we suspected we might. So Ryan, go ahead and take the next one.
Oh, all right. So let's see here. Mark is asking if we have a DoD client, but we do not have access to the data, assuming we're talking about CUI there. Does the potential level 1 requirement still apply? How does it change the landscape based on MSP access to the client? So we kind of talked about that a little bit in regards to the DFARS definitions of a covered system. The thing is that any data that you have as an MSP that isn't cleared for public release about your client or their performance of contracts is probably going to be considered federal contract information, or FCI. And that stuff's a lot harder to track because there's no marking requirements for it. So just imagine if your customer discusses anything with you about their defense contracting or its performance, or, hey, this is important because this is due next month, whatever, that's probably going to rate as being FCI. And so that would pretty much enroll you into CMMC level 1. I think the safe bet would be that MSPs providing for defense contractors should at a minimum look at level 1 for all of their support infrastructure that they use for client environments, including things like ticketing and email. And that's pretty attainable. That's 17 practices. And the maturity level is just that you're doing it. So that would be what I would look at from a level 1 perspective. Yeah, I mean, you can continue to search and look for edge cases and policy manage the end client and eventually get to a position where maybe you don't need that even. But I mean, you would put almost more work into doing that than just pursuing level 1.
So Ryan, you've done such a good job here, Ken, you and David as well, that you've actually caused a fight. In chat, we have, I think Jim and Sam are going to take this one outside into the parking lot to see who gets an hour of your time.
At the flagpole at the end of the school day.
How do I know that we've had a good webinar when we have our attendees want to get in a fight with each other? That's how I know. I've always said that. So Ryan, take us out on one final question. And then also, Ryan, I want to make sure that you in particular leave your contact details for those that may want to reach out to you in the future, how they can get in touch with you. And then after you answer your question, Andrew, we're going to bring you back up and we're going to let you close this out.
Sure. So one of the questions we have here, I've recently seen a huge uptick in primes going to their subs to push for a deadline with the DFARS interim rule. What specifically is being talked about there is that self-score that you would upload. This has made some people believe that the DoD is kicking the can on CMMC and that they won't be affected until 2025. Am I the only one hearing this, or is it a broader concern? CMMC was already planned to be a phased 5-year rollout. So I wouldn't see this as kicking the can. If anything, this is adding to the existing plans. So by having organizations upload a self-assessment score, it's yet another source selection criteria or metric that DoD can use to hand out awards. So if anything, I would see it as an acceleration of enforcement strategies rather than waiting around for the eventual 5-year rollout of CMMC to hit every possible contractor.
Got it. The illustrious Ryan Bonner, thank you for joining us today. That's been fantastic. David Powell, as always, my friend, thank you for your insights. Ken Tripp, we couldn't do this without you as well. So thank you, sir, as well. Andrew, we're going to let you pick back up in the last couple minutes and kind of close us out with our winner and any closing thoughts you have.
Well, first, Wes, thank you. What I would like to do is thank the audience. This was fun. Like you said, when you can get an audience into an argument, fist fight, whatever, I think it's par for the course right now with the election. Not that I would go there, Wes, but anyway, just trying to have fun with everybody. But great. Thank you guys out there and gals for being so interactive. This webinar flew. I guess what I would ask of you guys is the audience, what you'd like to see more of. Do you want more of this? What could be helpful for you guys? We've had Ryan on the cyber call. And so those types of things, any kind of feedback, you can send it to, I am easy to get to, Andrew@thecybernation.com. Wes, maybe you could throw that in the chat real quick while I'm talking and wrapping things up. We are open to feedback. Our whole mission in putting things like this together, the cyber call, the Cyber Nation, and the content we've been doing is truly to help everyone elevate their game. So, I want to thank, certainly Ken, Ryan, David, really appreciate it. Wes, as always, thank you. Our winner chicken dinner. Ken, are you there, by the way?
I am. Yep. Video
just for you.
Went south, but I'm here.
All right. So we have an Ed Delgado as our winner. Now, Ed, you will have to, sounds like, get into a fist fight. I think it was with Sam or...
Yeah, Jim and Sam are going to be waiting for him in the parking lot to take it back.
Okay. Fair enough. So, so Ken, we'll make sure you get
where you live. You're on a cyber call. Of course, everybody knows where you live. I also know your social, the high school you went to.
So any just quick closing comments? We're at the top of the hour, but any closing comments, Ryan, that you would like to share with the group?
I just think that if I could encourage one thing for MSPs, it's that you have to make the defense contractors' challenges your challenges, internalize them, proceduralize them, and then turn them into an offering, because that's the only way this scales. We don't need people in the MSP space to be displaced by their inability to solve challenges for the defense industrial base. We want it to be a growth opportunity, and that can start now internally.
Yeah, great closing comments. My closing comments, by the way, because there were some questions about Perch and Netwrix. Look at if you're looking for a tool that discovers and has the taxonomies for CUI, I highly encourage you guys to get in touch with Ken. And David and Wes, their team put together a great document on CMMC and how Perch helps with that compliance. So with that, want to close things out by thanking you, Wes, again for moderating. Thanks everybody, and have a fantastic day. Take care.